We'd like to start this afternoon's session with greetings from Hans Reinders, who's been one of the founders of the Summer Institute. In fact, I should have said yesterday when we talked about the 10 years of the Institute that in fact the first year John Swinton and Hans Reinders ended up being the coordinators on site because I happened to be in the middle of a major clinical depression at that time. When you have friends who come in and step up and take that over, it's pretty amazing and one of the real gifts to me. But Hans was also the one who dreamed up the idea of having a PhD symposium for the Institute about the third or fourth year, and it became a place for people who are in PhD programs looking at this area to have a community, essentially, of people who are working on that subject together, because there's not much of, there are not a huge number of graduate students yet doing that kind of work, and they certainly weren't at that point. So Hans wanted 5 minutes to give greetings to this afternoon and set the tones for this session. Hans?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a kind of a mixed feeling to be present among you in this way. I think in all these years of the Summer Institute, this has been the first year that I'm not with you. But the opportunity of addressing the fact that this year we can celebrate 3 PhD people is a great opportunity to say a few things that I very much appreciate. But first, let me start by sending you greetings from Chantal Huynings. I'm not sure how many people, old-timers in a sense, are in the room, but those who are will know Chantal. She was with me in Amsterdam about a week ago, and I think she's probably leaving Paris now for Thésée. And of course also best greetings from my wife Lydia. Both she and myself would have loved to join you this year, but perhaps on another occasion. With regard to this opportunity of celebrating the 3 people who have obtained their PhD these years, let me go back a bit in the history of the Summer Institute. I think it will have been in about 2012, 2013, when we began to understand, we being the faculty of the Institute, that we began to understand that this thing might not go away for a while and be with us for some time. And also at the same time where we started to discover that the idea of being a touring circus, visiting different theological schools in each summer might be a very useful way of trying to get it done, that we started to think about the possibility of connecting the Summer Institute with goals related to education. Many students and participants told us that opportunities to follow courses on theology and disability were not all too many. So we started to think in terms of perhaps the Summer Institute should be the kind of place where this gap can be fulfilled. And so that's, I think, when we started to think about running a PhD seminar. I'm sure I didn't look it up. I think 2014 must have been the first one, which would mean that this year's PhD seminar would be number 5 or number 6, I'm not sure. In any case, that was the time that some people started to gain confidence in the idea that it might be worthwhile to pursue a PhD project in the area of theology and disability. And today we can celebrate the fact that 3 of them have succeeded in getting there. It's definitely not the case that they are the only ones, because there are many on the way, and hopefully in the future also be successful in obtaining their goal. But it's definitely the case that the Summer Institute has contributed to the kind of future that people will see, will found for themselves in looking for further work on theology and disability. I don't think it's by accident that this year is also the year, I'm not sure how much Bill has shared with you about this, but this year is also the year that new leadership in the Summer Institute is stepping up, which I think is very good. After all, the Institute started as what by now probably might be described as a group of old male Protestants. I deliberately exclude white, not to get let John Swinton off the hook. My good friend John, I should say. And there is a new generation of leadership stepping up and taking their responsibility in thinking of how this entire project of theology and disability might be taken into the future. There is one thing specific about this enterprise. I recall that ever since the first year we started to get in Gettysburg 2 years, and then Chicago Catholic Union Seminary, I think, we prided ourselves for not being a conference or a theological meeting, and I think that was very important, and I hope it's still the kind of experience that you have also this year. One could say we were so much and still are so much of a community that it even didn't need to call itself a community to be one. With regard to the PhDs, Keith Dow, Jason Grieg, and Sarah Barton, I do not want to go into specifics since they will address you in a few moments, each of them, with regard to their project. So it's not for me to comment on these matters. I just want publicly to say that being involved in various ways in their project and helping them and supervising them was a great honor and very much a great joy. I hope you will enjoy their talks and get interested in what their project have resulted into. And I suggest you join me in giving them a great round of applause.
So we will instead introduce Keith Dow, who studied with Hans at VU, the Free University, and I have known Keith for many, many years, and I'm so excited that you finished, and your pictures were amazing. I'm jealous you got to go abroad to do that. So everyone, welcome Keith. Dr. Dow.
Thanks, everyone. When Hiroshi was doing well, he was a pleasure to be with. The way that his hands would move and flow in the air in front of him as he walked, almost like they were dancing, was a beauty to witness. When he wasn't doing so well, we knew immediately by the behavior that we saw, perhaps more accurately, the behavior that we felt, as we needed to dodge his advances to avoid being scratched or grabbed. And when he ended up curled up on his bed, we knew that his pain had become so bad that he had to go to the hospital. He had gastrointestinal problems, and often due to the medications that he was on, and the cocktail of other medication that he was on to help alleviate the symptoms didn't always work. I'll never forget one such visit to the hospital where he was staying. I was a new support worker. It was a large organization serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Canada. I had just arrived to spell off a colleague. Hiroshi needed two-on-one support at all times in order to be able to provide the crisis intervention techniques that would help keep him and others safe. I learned upon stepping into that room that he had been asleep or knocked out for the past 2 hours, and my colleague who was there felt like that would be a great time to go down to the cafeteria and get something to eat. I went to sit down in the less than comfortable chair angled in the corner of the room, and as I took in my surroundings, as I was taught to assess the hazards that were there, I recognized that there were too many to count. It was an austere room, and simple and pragmatic, almost minimalist, but just out of reach, there were countless medical instruments and sharp corners that could cause injury. This was not the controlled environment that we were used to. In Hiroshi's own apartment, it was a balance of hospitality and safety that had to be maintained. And so the television where he watched his favorite shows was in behind plexiglass. The speakers that played his favorite music were up high where they couldn't be reached. And the corners there were padded to prevent injury. Before I had a chance to sit down, something caught my eye, and as I glanced over, Hiroshi's eyes met my own. Full of pain and confusion, he rised from the bed before I had a chance to really gather what was going on. I knew in that moment that the crisis intervention techniques we had been taught would be ineffective. It immediately became a matter of personal safety, both for him and for me. In hindsight, I suppose this was a decision point. Either I abandoned him to go find my coworker to provide the types of supports that we could and prevent self-injury, but doing it in this way, I risked serious injury to himself by leaving him alone. Solo intervention, on the other hand, if I was attempting to intervene, would break professional and ethical standards for crisis support. At the time, though, there was no real choice to make. I knew what I had to do, what I was called to do, and questions haunted his expression as he came towards me. It's stories such as this one that led me to investigate, as part of my PhD work under the direction of Hans and Tom Reynolds, what is the ethical motivation and formation for caregiving within Christian faith-based service provision? What was it that kept me in the hospital room that day, and what stories might help or hinder ethical formation for direct support professionals? Stories, although most weren't this dramatic, were interspersed throughout my project, together with insights from thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Alistair MacIntyre, Judith Butler, and the disability theologians who we've come to know and love through conferences such as this one. My hope is that our talk over the next few minutes will help us to consider what are the theological and ethical significance of the stories that we tell, of the stories that we share over the next few days together and beyond. What are the virtues, the postures, and the practices that help us to tell these stories well? Indigenous author Thomas King once said that the truth about stories is that's all we are. And I'm inclined to agree with him, and yet the way we tell these stories is part of their truth, part of their importance. What does it mean to tell my story if I don't use words to communicate? Maybe I use a violin or a cello. What does it mean to tell my story if I don't have a higher level of education? What does it mean to tell my story if I don't physically have access to the buildings where the stories are being told? What does it mean to tell my story if I can't put it together in the way that you expect to hear it, due to my cognitive ability? You see, within the Western intellectual tradition, our stories carry with them a weight of moral accountability. And so for those who struggle to tell their stories, you can be looked at as an angel, incapable of doing any wrong, as a devil, unable to do anything right, or perhaps even worse, as an amoral agent who isn't able to fully flourish as a human being because you're not able to fully understand or articulate why you do what you do. But I'm going to share a secret with you here today, and it's a secret not because we don't know it, but because we hesitate to speak it out loud. And that is that not one of us fully understands or is able to articulate our own stories. Oh, we try, often with slightly different variations each time. And for many of us, people tend to believe the stories that we tell about ourselves. Many of us can pass as knowing what we're talking about when we're describing our own lives. But we don't know. Not really. So many of our experiences are not talk-aboutable. That day in the hospital room, I don't really know what made me stay rather than running away. It wasn't the training that I had received. Sure, in the next few moments, there in that hospital room, it helped me to know how to respond. As Hiroshi and I grappled and danced towards and away from hazards, engaging and disengaging, almost like Jacob and the angel, as Julian Watts-Belser talked about so beautifully last year at this institute. Who is Jacob? Who is the angel? I'm not sure. And in that moment, that split second when our eyes locked, when we encountered each other face to face as he climbed out of his hospital bed, I can't tell you what I was thinking then. That part of my story is opaque. It's a mystery. Or as Winston Churchill once said about Russian strategy, it's a riddle wrapped in mystery inside an enigma. And I'm not going to try that in the British accent. Yet, unfortunately, enigmas don't make for well-defended dissertations. And the reality is that we don't tend to think that mystery makes for a good story unless it's well resolved. And that's whether we're talking about moral theology or just with our neighbor down the street. And so, uncomfortable with the unknown, we fall for 3 myths of transparency. I'm going to walk through these quickly. First, we think that we can fully know or understand one another, that I can see through you, that you are transparent to me. Yet, our knowledge of each other is built on first impressions and misperceptions, projections and presumptions. These stigmas and speculations are at best hasty generalizations and at worst prejudiced passions. I almost feel like the start of spoken word is coming on there, but I won't. My understanding of you too often comes from a misunderstanding of myself. And so we must turn inward and face the myth of the transparent self. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, out of the abundance or out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Our misdirected stories often arise out of a disordered heart. We think we know ourselves, but we are not alone. We are not our own. In Exclusion and Embrace, Miroslav Volf describes, the self is dialogically constructed. The other is already from the outset part of the self. I am who I am in relation to the other. And I think we've heard that said in different ways here this week already. I am not a monologue. Your story is always already part of my own. And if we are to walk alongside one another in this mystery, we have to have grace with one another's stories and come to make peace with our own. Finally, the third myth of transparency, we bow to the tyranny of the transparent as our own stories arise from the story that we tell about God. We cling to the myth of a transparent God, don't we? A God whom we can understand and articulate, almost control. But as Augustine reminds us, if we comprehend God as we think we have comprehended God, it is not really God whom we have comprehended. That's my paraphrase. Any theology or philosophy worth holding on to must not only grapple with those things that we understand, whether that's professionalism or code of conducts or core competencies, but those things which we cannot. Our ethical framework must be applicable to all of humanity and not rest on this misperception of self-aware storytellers. Not one of us tells our story alone. We are all pieces of a larger puzzle. We are woven into families, friendships, and communities that define who we are in ways we can only begin to articulate or comprehend. It is this relationality, this experience of belonging and interdependence that makes it impossible to fully give an account of who we are. Feels like we've traveled a long way from that hospital room, face to face with Hiroshi. In that moment, my own instinct for self-preservation was overridden by an encounter, by a demand. Before professional commitments, before learned techniques or rational calculations, I knew, if it can even be called knowing, what I had to do. The moments that followed, they're a blur in my mind. I know that eventually my colleague came back and we were able to provide the support that was needed. Miraculously, neither of us were injured. And for Hiroshi, over the past number of years, he's learned to use an iPad to communicate. His medication has been gotten under control, and the scars on his face from self-injurious behavior have been healed. What I realized looking back, though, is that no amount of training or ethical study could have prepared me for that moment. My motivation to respond came down to a fundamental obligation to him as an image bearer of the divine. As Shelley Christensen's rabbi said, when you look into each person's eyes and see the spark of the divine, you won't wonder how to treat them. You'll know. It's the mystery at the heart of this encounter with one another towards which we gesture when we talk about being created in the image of God. What we hesitatingly, haltingly, and imperfectly hint toward is that this responsibility transcends any rational calculation. In finding ourselves before God, we are before one another. In that hospital room, I was my brother's keeper, and he was mine. The story, of course, could be told in multiple ways as the fledgling support worker who comes in and helps out the person with a disability. Or it could be told that I was a representative of the power and the structures that led to that state of pain and confusion and that environment in the first place. And I suppose each has their own degree of truth. Regardless, in that moment, I know we were there to keep each other. I needed his forgiveness as much or more than he needed mine. What I'm suggesting here today is that our sense of virtue and right behavior must be reframed in profound humility for what we can know or give an account of. They must be virtues of discovery rather than virtues of transparency. Virtues of care, if you will. Care both in the sense of our relational encounter with another, but also in its original sense of grief, of loss, of mourning over all that we cannot give an account of, all that we cannot know, all that we cannot comprehend or remember. We need virtues like courageous humility, in recognizing that I don't have all the answers, and yet having the courage to share my story anyways, and to listen to the stories of others. Virtues of lament and mourning, of confession and forgiveness, of quiet attentiveness, of loving mercy. I love this book, and you can come and have a look at it later if you want. It's called Peace is an Offering, and I want to read a few lines from it. It says, "Peace is the word you say to a brother or sister. Will you stay with me? Will you be my friend? Will you listen to my story till the very end?" This is my prayer for our next couple of days together, for the weeks and months to come, that our stories, whether they're practical or academic or personal, are offered up like a peace offering to one another and to God. Let's be present to one another here, building friendships, hearing one another's stories to their very end. I believe that a theology of intellectual humility leads to communities where all are welcome, communities where we encounter one another full of grace and truth, communities like this one, where we gather together not in spite of our ability to give a full account, but because of it, because we need one another in order for our stories to be told. Thank you.
That was so lovely. Thank you, Keith. So we're going to try with Sarah once again. Hopefully we've got all the technology figured out this time. So once again, welcome Dr. Sarah Barton.
It is a joy to be here with all of you today, and I am really grateful for Hans and Bill and all the others that made it possible for me to share with you a teeny tiny slice of a teeny tiny part of my dissertation. But to start our time together today, I want to share with you a little bit about someone I know, and we'll call her Hallie, even though that's not her real name. Hallie is a teenager, and she lives in North Carolina. She loves the color pink and listening to extremely loud gospel music at all hours of the day. Hallie also happens to live with cerebral palsy and an intellectual disability, and she communicates in a variety of different ways, but she does not use speech. And I met Hallie when I was working as an occupational therapist at Duke Hospital. So when I first met Hallie, her mother was kind of sizing me up. She thought I probably hadn't been an OT for that long, or hadn't worked at Duke for that long. She said, "How long have you even been here?" And I said, "Well, I've actually worked at Duke for about 5 years, but I only work in the clinic once or twice a week." And Hallie's mom responded to me, "Well, what else do you do?" As if working part-time is not enough. And I said, "Well, I actually study and teach theology, and I have a focus on disability." And Hallie's mother's face lit up, and she said to me, "Really? I cannot tell you how many churches Hallie and I have been through. But I guess we're not really church people anymore. I can't count the number of times we were asked to leave because of the noises Hallie makes during a service." And then Hallie's mom continued to tell me, "You know, Hallie isn't even baptized. And I've always wanted this for her. I want the church to see Hallie how I do, as a precious child of God. But I guess the Christian church isn't really a place for people with intellectual disabilities, especially those who will never talk. So Hallie's story has really stuck with me. The realities of Hallie's mother desiring her baptism, but the repeated response of church communities in turning them both away. And I think, unfortunately, this is a familiar story to many of us. What Hallie's story suggests, among many things, is a disruption of hospitality within Christian religious communities. So despite common signage or website headlines suggesting all are welcome here or come as you are, many churches in the Christian tradition struggle to welcome and to integrate and to embrace the presence and gifts of people with intellectual disabilities, as well as their loved ones. So while many religious communities have a self-understanding of being welcoming and inclusive, extensions of welcome, actual practices of hospitality on the ground, often find their roots in welcoming only a very particular kind of person. Perhaps recall some of your own experiences coming into a new religious community. First encounters often center on shared affinity. Wow, my spouse has worked in that same industry for 10 years, or, oh, I've also been an Episcopalian my whole life, or do you have a dog? We have a doggy playgroup once a month. So these sites of commonality and affinity serve as natural avenues through which individuals can meaningfully plug in at a local religious community. And often, the stronger the similarity between newcomers and the majority of members present in an existing religious community, the greater the ease of integration of those who are new. In particular, people who engage in conversation with a certain comfort and familiarity, those who others in the community may look up to and wish to emulate. These people come to be perceived as those who are especially welcome. John Swinton frames this in the following way. We shape our interpretive universes in dialogue with our partners, pastors, friends, our academic colleagues, and so forth, all of whom, for the most part, are people who are not particularly different from ourselves. Most people rarely get the opportunity to become persons in relation with people whose life experience and existential perspectives are significantly different from their own. So as Swinton claims here, newcomers in a community who initially seem to present with more differences than affinities did not receive the same ease of integration into religious communities. And these disparities in affinity disproportionately and negatively affect particular groups of people. People living with severe and persistent mental illness, people with dementia, people with minority gender identities and sexual orientations, and people across the lifespan with intellectual disabilities. As theologian Mary McClintock Fulkerson highlights, discomfort with any significant differences between worshipers in a single community, including differences in disability identity, typically produces strikingly homogeneous communities. Communities where almost everybody seems to be the same. So for example, in the case of people with intellectual disabilities, people like Hallie, descriptions of a church community may consistently affirm their welcome and inclusion. However, these descriptions merely offer a symbolic gesture rather than an embodied reality. As a result, people with intellectual disabilities and their loved ones often face discomfort and awkwardness, and at times outright rejection, as we see with Hallie's story. Communities who root their practices of belonging in commonality or affinity, typically communities marked by homogeneity, cultivate insufficient imaginations and insufficient practices to welcome belonging among people who do not present with a number of relatable similarities. So as we saw in Hallie's story, this may result in the denial of baptism in Christian communities, or more generally, rejection from participation in the ritual life of a religious community. In response to this problem of religious communities of homogeneous belonging, How might we break away from modes of belonging that rely on this commonality, this affinity, and this comfort, to instead offer and sustain communities marked by radical hospitality and diversity? And more specifically, what resources and practices particular to our own religious traditions, in my case, the Christian tradition, what resources and practices within our traditions themselves draw together those who are far apart? When thinking about these questions, in particular relationship to belonging among people with intellectual disabilities, Christian theologians concerned with disability typically draw upon themes of friendship and God's image and inclusion to imagine new ways to cultivate communities of belonging for all people, including those with intellectual disability. And these theological ideas about friendship and God's image and inclusion try and find new and creative ways to imagine anthropology. That is, what makes human beings, or what characteristics or relationships define who we are as human creatures. I think that in addition to friendship and God's image and inclusion, the ritual practices of religious communities, practices in the Christian tradition such as catechesis or baptism or Eucharist, can tell us a lot about the anthropologies that are at work, that are playing out on the ground, in particular gatherings of faithful people. Looking at the actual practices of communities, not just what they say their practices might be, can tell us who counts as a full human being, who really belongs, who we think has an indispensable role, and in Christian communities, who really belongs as a disciple of Jesus with a baptismal identity and a vocation to discipleship. We see this clearly in Hallie's story. If we were curious about what the churches Hallie and her mother tried to attend believed about anthropology, what they think makes us fully human, it becomes pretty clear that the anthropologies at these churches don't have room for Hallie, because there wasn't room for Hallie in their practices of baptism. So while we might look for evidence of belonging for people with intellectual disabilities related to God's image or friendship or inclusion, these are sometimes a bit hard to discern. They can be hard to see in action. So I think it's important to push on some of these sometimes abstracted yet highly popular theological categories. And when we're engaging religious communities, to try and simply discern what bodies make up the daily, sometimes boring, ordinary ritual life of the community. Who shows up at services week in and week out, not just a special weekend. Whose bodies are part of the after-service coffee hour, who shows up at midweek gatherings, on mission trips, in prayers, and in meals. And in addition, it's also important for us to look at the paradigmatic practices of faith communities, whose bodies are present to participate in observing the high holy days, who gets baptized, and who takes the Lord's Supper. While many academics have argued for the importance of looking at these communal practices for discerning the core beliefs of a community, such as beliefs about anthropology, my favorite way of framing this question comes from Sister Helen Prejean, who's a Roman Catholic nun from Louisiana, and she's most famously known in the United States for her work on abolishing the death penalty. In the opening of her 2008 essay for National Public Radio's This, I Believe series, Sister Prejean puts it this way: I watch what I do to see what I really believe. I watch what I do to see what I really believe. What a simple yet important test for us to embrace and for religious communities to seriously take up, especially when communities we know or communities we are a part of boast these statements on their websites and front doors and service bulletins like, everyone is welcome here. Do these communities really practice in both their ordinary and extraordinary ritual lives together affirmation of all people in all their complexities and precarities and limitations? And while we could probably all take this I watch what I do to see what I really believe approach and easily criticize any number of religious communities for failing to enact their stated beliefs, particularly in their relationship to people with intellectual disabilities. Today, I instead want to close briefly by talking about one way that I have watched some Christian churches practice what they believe, with specific regard to the full and complex and embodied participation of people with intellectual disabilities in their life together. This one way that I have seen Christian churches push against patterns of belonging that rely on homogeneity, of everyone being the same, are practices of baptism, and one specific practice being that of baptismal testimony. I should clarify that when I talk about baptism, what I have in mind is the Christian ritual of initiation into the church, incorporation into Jesus' body, which is typically celebrated with water poured on the head of the baptized or into which the baptized person is immersed in the name of God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the specific practice of baptismal testimony is perhaps a bit less clear to us. So what I have in mind when I say baptismal testimony is a practice with actually multiple avenues for participation. Some people, both with and without intellectual disabilities, may offer a spoken testimony in front of their religious community, an account of what God has done in their life, why they might desire to be baptized, what gifts they hope to exercise in a community. A good illustration of this comes from a collaborator in my dissertation research named James. James is a young adult with an intellectual disability, and he's an active disciple of Jesus and a member at his Baptist church. At James's church, there's a tradition of a family member or a close friend reading the testimony of the person who is to be baptized. James told me in one of our conversations together, I was very important on my baptism day. And before, I was preparing with my mom, and she helped me to tell my testimony to my sister. James showed me a video of his baptism, including his baptismal testimony read by his sister, excitingly pointing out the moment when his sister read his testimony aloud for the whole gathered community to hear. This proclamation of James's identity as a disciple of Jesus and a fully baptized member of his church remains a strong source of identity for James 15 years after his baptism, because he watches a video of his baptism every week and sometimes every day. But you may wonder, how helpful is this practice of baptismal testimony actually going to be among people with more profound experiences of intellectual disability, people who are non-speakers, or among anyone who's baptized as an infant or a young child? In my conversation with another research collaborator named Anna, a lay leader at an Episcopal church that practices pedobaptism or infant baptism, she wondered out loud how baptismal celebrations might make space for the testimony of people with more significant intellectual disabilities. And Anna lamented to me, I really struggle sometimes about how our church holds people up. There are some kids that don't have those cultural successes. How do we make sure that all are celebrated in our churches? Anna was troubled by why churches would celebrate academic and career and social milestones in their ritual lives, especially when these celebrations exclude so many people, both with and without intellectual disabilities. For Anna, these cultural successes threaten to displace the primacy of baptismal identity for Christians, an identity rooted in belonging to Jesus' body across the many diversities of the life of all the baptized. So Anna's question spurred my thinking about how practices of baptismal testimony might serve as a powerful witness among people, including some people with intellectual disability who communicate without words. And as I ruminated with Anna's question, two practices of baptismal testimony struck me as particularly powerful. The first is that of baptism itself as a wordless testimony or a preaching, and the second, a communal practice of composing a baptismal testimony. One research participant, Pastor Daniel, talked about the wordless testimony of the ritual of baptism in this way. He said, before baptisms, I always say to the community, most folks are not going to remember what I preached today. but they will never forget what they see you preach in your actions today. You know, the very core of our faith is that in being buried with Jesus, we are raised with him to a life like his. You are preaching this. In addition to baptism itself as a wordless testimony, another powerful practice can be Christians coming together to write a testimony of discipleship for someone who cannot express it in their own words. This is one example of the church taking seriously the belonging, gifts, and discipleship of people with more profound intellectual disabilities. And this kind of communal practice of baptismal testimony can work in communities that baptize babies, as well as communities who baptize older children and adults. This ritual practice may consist in writing a letter on the occasion of the baptism of an infant or a small child to be read aloud in the community, as a sign of the community's promises to support this person throughout their life and baptismal vocation, not just on that baptism day. This kind of testimony might be written anew each year as the community comes to know someone more deeply, becoming more closely attuned to their gifts and their needs, reaffirming both the centrality of the person's baptismal identity as indispensable to the church, and also as a reminder of the seriousness of the community's promises to continue to love, support, and nurture all the baptized. The witness of Christian churches in this practice of baptismal testimony proclaims what these churches really believe about human creatures with and without intellectual disabilities. That all people are beloved, all people have gifts for ministry, all people are complex, and invite us to be present to them, to listen to them, to attend to them, and to amplify the witness and presence of their lives. And specifically, in the context of Christian communities, this ritual practice of baptismal testimony affirms that all the baptized are indispensable to the church. That is, people with and without intellectual disabilities are indispensable to the body of Christ, to being the body of Christ, what I call in my work, the baptized body. We will leave here in a few days. Well, some of us, I live here, but most of us will leave here at the end of the week. And we're going to return to a variety of places where we work and where we serve and where we worship. And I suspect that some of these places have looked at what they do to see what they really believe, in order that they can be transformed and truly welcome the diverse gifts of all God's people. People like Hallie, people like James, people like me, and people like you, welcoming their gifts without pity, without patronizing, but fully participating in ritual life together. So I hope together that we can affirm the belovedness of all human creatures through not only talking the talk of disability theology, but watching what we do as religious communities to pay attention to the communal work of showing up faithfully together, of listening, and of amplifying the witness of each other's lives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. Our final speaker is Dr. Jason Grieg. Jason graduated way back in November, but he already has a book that you can buy out in the other room, so you should check that out. So I'm very excited to hear about what you're going to talk about today. Welcome, Dr. Jason.
I also just want to give my thanks and deep gratitude to be able to share and to be formed in this community to come to this point. It's very much a privilege. I also just preface briefly before I begin, I'm going to be talking about the work of Jean Vanier in this presentation. And I must say that I'm going to have difficulty talking about Jean Vanier in the past tense. I began this before, 2 weeks ago when he passed away, and I have to say I have significant difficulty in moving to the past tense at times. So be merciful and gracious if my tenses slip and my sense of time is rather expansive. So Jean Vanier was a man of gentle but stirring passion. One of his passions is probably readily known to us, and that was the passion for the liberation and the advocacy for the empowerment of people labeled as intellectually disabled. Vanier also had a profound passion to see God's peace received and witnessed in the world. And these two passions for him were deeply entwined. The violence that he saw the men that he lived with undergo in an indifferent world, to him, was just another face to the violence between nations and between other individuals. But Vanier had another passion, maybe not as readily known, and that was the passion for the church, particularly for a reconciled and witnessing church. Behind me is a picture of the Il Chico community in Rome when they welcomed a stranger for tea around a table. And that stranger in the middle was Francis I, Pope Francis I, who was welcomed to their table. Vanier's vision of a church seamlessly tries to integrate his other two passions. And he wrote the following in the context of articulating how to break down the walls that divide persons and groups and build friendships across borders. I'll quote it in full. Jesus came to change a world in which those at the top have privilege, power, prestige, and money, while those at the bottom are seen as useless. Jesus came to create a body. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 compares the human body to the body of Christ, and he says that those parts of the body that are the weakest and least presentable are indispensable to the body. In other words, people who are the weakest and least presentable are indispensable to the church. I have never seen this as the first line of a book on ecclesiology. Who really believes it? But this is the heart of faith of what it means to be the church. Do we really believe that the weakest, the least presentable, those we hide away, that they are indispensable? If that was our vision of the church, it would change many things, unquote. I begin with this quote because it essentially is the starting point for what became my doctoral research. Namely, what might an ecclesiology looks like that takes Vanier's challenge seriously? What if Paul's vision of and Vanier's challenge to the church became the first line of my dissertation? How might it turn out? Now, to be clear, Vanier and others in L'Arche never tried to fuse the church and L'Arche together. He's always insisted that L'Arche is not a church and should never seek to be one. What I believe he rather suggests is that L'Arche is a parable or a sign for the church about what the gospel of peace might actually look like. Rather than being a substitute for the church or a solution for the world, being a parable means recognizing L'Arche's inherent and radical incompleteness. L'Arche will always remain contingent, profoundly imperfect, too often sinful, but always reliant on God's grace to be itself. Yet when it faithfully witnesses to that grace, L'Arche can act as a, quote, story with intent, unquote. Biblical scholar Klein Snodgrass's definition of a parable, with the intent being a reimagining of the world that prompts a response of conversion. Thus, I will begin by offering a theological interpretation of L'Arche's history to tease out how Vanier and others in L'Arche understand their sense of identity and mission. Now, to be clear, this theological interpretation that I'm going to give you is very much my own and not an official or authorized one. Well, it's heavily inspired by Vanier's vision, along with my own experience. It is also very much grounded in the lived life, practices, and habits of large communities as they exist. The following behind me is a picture with two different images on it. One to your left is a picture of an early 1960s Renault. Jean Vanier tells a story often about when he began L'Arche. His intent was that it stayed no larger than that could fit in that Renault. Now to your right is a map of the world with pictures, with indications of the places where L'Arche has become. So L'Arche has a history and it has moved. I discern it in 4 ways. First, there was an immediate call by Vanier to found something, inspired by an encounter with men dehumanized and profoundly oppressed in institutions. He wanted to do something, unquote. And his something was to welcome men from those institutions to live together. So on August 4th, 1964, he welcomed them with much chaos and significant joy ensuing. What also happened is that the communities grew rapidly and quickly. In one sense, they grew quantitatively. Something was happening, and there were needs around them, and Vanier wanted to respond. And first those needs were in the community where he was. Then those needs were in India, and in Canada, and the United States, and throughout the world. And communities grew. But just as profoundly, L'Arche grew qualitatively, particularly through its welcome of persons labeled as profoundly intellectually disabled. Many of the first people welcomed could be, quote, integrated, unquote, in the local community. But it was through welcoming people like Edith and Loic that Vanier and others in L'Arche started to understand being in a profoundly different way. How those persons were calling Vanier and L'Arche to expand their notion of what L'Arche meant. As L'Arche grew, it grew in recognition from other agencies and from the world, which created a tension between that and Vanier's call for L'Arche to remain a countercultural and prophetic sign in the world. This tension helped L'Arche to become what David Ford calls, the theologian David Ford calls, wisdom communities. People who, through a lived experience together, were finding a practical wisdom in faith and in love that was offered to the world. And what I define as the fourth movement of L'Arche is an awareness, an attempt to witness to God's peace in the world as their vocation. In a world that can seem to be tearing itself apart because of difference, persons in L'Arche found themselves living, if not always perfectly, authentic moments of peace and reconciliation with a radically diverse array of people. This all the while trying to stay faithful to God in the midst of enormous pressures to conform to the practices and logic of social service bureaucracies. Now, what I hope this very brief snapshot reveals is that L'Arche, Vanier and others in L'Arche see their vocation as being much more than simply quality service provision or even social inclusion. Rather, L'Arche has been given a mission to witness to God's peace in the world through living reconciliation in very particular, in very imperfect yet inspiring ways. The reconciliation of the enemy and befriending of difference Vanier experienced and saw in L'Arche can act as a sign of the redemption Jesus inaugurated on the cross. As Paul mentions of Christ in the letter to the Ephesians, for he is our peace. In his flesh he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. For Vanier, the transformation of that enmity into friendship through communal life gave him the boldness to offer L'Arche as a parable for how the church might live its peace witness in the world. For Vanier, to begin to witness to peace means first to understand the origins of violence rather than merely its symptoms. As contingent creatures, human beings rely on love and recognition from caregivers and from groups of belonging. Yet that same contingency means that that need is not always met, and sometimes grievously so. When that need is not met, then you understand that a defense system erupts, driving persons to erect internal walls to protect themselves from the perception of a hostile world, creating enemies, quote unquote, as persons or groups who threaten the being of the self, in turn fueled by the competitive nature of Western modern societies. According to Vanier, peace comes first by the desire to disarm the weapons or defense systems of the heart, those compulsions which project fear onto others and erect walls dehumanizing and rejecting them. A prime place where this happens is through encounter with the other, quote unquote, in vulnerability and openness. In his experience of community life, Vanier witnessed the transformation which came when persons could no longer hide or run away from their own woundedness. Vanier tells his own story about being with Lucien, whose screams awoke a deep anguish within him, releasing or unveiling a violence that could potentially hurt weaker people. Quote, "It was as if part of my being that I had learned to control was exploding. It was not only Lucien's anguish that was difficult for me to accept, but the revelation of what was inside my heart, my capacity to hurt others. I, who had been called to share my life with the weak, had a power of hatred for a weaker person," unquote. Yet the true liberation came through journeying together with Lucien to the end and others in community, which liberated him through coming to know his darkness, but also being accepted and recognized in community nonetheless. In this way, it was sometimes people considered profoundly intellectually disabled who represented for Vanier prophets of peace, and often it exemplified the atypical wisdom of God, quote unquote, referenced by Paul in the Corinthian letters. So what does Vanier mean by peace? Vanier is not a systematic thinker by any means, but in my excavation of his work, I found him referring to peace in three ways. First, peace is a condition or state of unity, or more properly, communion. This is not a static form of conformity, but welcomes difference as it finds its end in the common project of sharing life together. Second, peace is an eschatological goal that draws us forward to our final end. What he sees more as a wedding banquet than a military parade. Third, and the most predominant for Vanier, is that peace is not just a noun, but also a verb. Vanier speaks most about peace as an action done and lived in community, a dynamic process that must be practiced with others and not simply thought about. Through performing actions like loving the enemy, welcoming the stranger, and befriending and being befriended by the dispossessed, followers of Jesus become what Catherine Spink calls marginals, a potentially apt term for the church and Christian believers in a post-Christian age. This kind of community seeks to be and become peace cultures, what Quaker sociologist Elise Boulding defines as, quote, a culture that includes lifeways, patterns of belief, values, behavior, and accompanying institutional arrangements that promote mutual caring and well-being, as well as an equality that includes appreciation of difference, stewardship, and equitable sharing of the earth's resources, unquote. As a peace culture, L'Arche trains members in nonviolence as a way of life, as well as create the forms which translate and cultivate a culture's peaceableness. When L'Arche lives its vocation faithfully, it shows the church how cultivating a particular culture is inseparable from the peace witness it offers. This orientation does not include the need for the church to take, quote, responsibility for the salvation of the world. Rather, the church's peace witness lies above all in its being a faithful community of witness and service, which offers the world a parable that violence and enmity are not inevitable. As Vanier writes, we cannot change the world, but we can create places where we celebrate life, where we give thanks that we are living together as human beings in a beautiful world. L'Arche as a peace culture cultivates and makes receptive in its members peaceable habits or gifts which dispose persons to live peace as a way of life. These 4 gifts, which are mentioned here, mutuality, trust, patience, and tenderness, intertwine with each other in seeking to produce bodies that encounter other bodies in a spirit of nonviolence, friendship, and deep respect. The Christian tradition has always had a place for the virtues, and I believe these spirit-inspired habits fit into that tradition. L'Arche's experience of finding those habits in very atypical people and communities, however, points to Paul's representation of the body, where we believe those we are graciously including are sometimes, in fact, showing the way to live life well and on the path to happiness. The forms which L'Arche uses to make ready and receive these habits is in embodied communal practices. While there are many potential practices in L'Arche, I emphasize 5: hospitality, storytelling, prayer, forgiveness, and celebration. These are deeply human activities that shape members into people who can live life well. Yet for those communities with more overt theological convictions, these practices also act as responses of gratitude for God's presence and the vocation to witness to peace in a fragmented world. Many of the ecclesial practices which correspond to these practices might be familiar to us: baptism, preaching, foot washing, the Eucharist, and others. Yet the ecstatic nature of God's love means that God's peace must overflow into the world beyond the church's doors. L'Arche offers provocative examples of how the practices of peace in daily life prepare communities to witness to peace in the world. And I'll leave you with one story of that witness. Behind me are images of things in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. On the left is an image of a church, St. Vincent de Paul Church. And on your right is an image of people around a table sorting peanuts, part of the sources of revenue for L'Arche in Port-au-Prince. One day, the community leader was in her office and she got a visit from the local priest. And the priest had with him a small boy who had a profound cognitive impairment and complex disabilities. And the priest asked the community leader, "Can you take this boy? I found him on the steps of my church today, and I have no place for him. Can you take it?" And the name of that church was Vincent de Paul. And can you take Vincent? Vincent was his name. They did not know his name. And the community leader, she considered her community, and she thought in her head, there's no way. We do not have the resources. We have very few people. We have very little money. We can't do it. But she said, I will go to all the members of my community and I will ask them. I'm conflicted. I will ask them. Expecting that generally the answer would be no. And so the community leader, Yvette, went to all the 3 homes of the community, and she sat down with everybody and she asked them. And every single person said, we need to welcome Vincent. He needs to come. He has no place to go. So they welcomed Vincent. And I'm profoundly struck by the story because in my Canadian context, If a priest would have come to me or to Lars, can you take this boy? We would have said, he can go to community services, to child services. That's what we have those things for, right? It's good to have those things, but in a way it lets me off the hook. I don't have to make a choice with Vincent in front of me. And Yvette could not have that choice. And what if that witness of Yvette and Lars in Port-au-Prince, as faith communities, what would we do if that priest came to us with Vincent? Could we take him, or do we give him to the social service bureaucracies? Let that story be with us today as we hear many other stories with each other about how to be witnesses of peace